What happens when one simple question transforms an ordinary daytime interview into a conversation that leaves an entire studio holding its breath? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Prime Spotlight, leave a like, and tell us your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's dive into this fictional story. The familiar theme music faded as the audience erupted into applause. The hosts welcomed Scarlett Johansson with warm smiles as she crossed the stage, waving appreciatively before taking her seat. The atmosphere felt relaxed. Whoopi Goldberg opened with a few jokes that had everyone laughing, while Sarah Haynes asked about Scarlett's latest project. Sunny Hostin praised her career, and Alyssa Farah Griffin complimented her ability to balance blockbuster films with independent work. For several minutes, everything unfolded exactly as viewers expected. Then Joy Behar leaned forward. "Scarlett," Joy began with a thoughtful smile, "you've built an incredible career by staying selective. But do you ever think celebrities sometimes avoid difficult conversations because it's simply easier?" The audience grew quieter. Scarlett smiled politely. "I don't think avoiding something and choosing your moment are the same thing." Joy nodded. "So you believe timing matters more than speaking immediately?" "I believe thoughtful conversations accomplish more than emotional reactions." A few audience members applauded. Whoopi noticed the shift in energy. "That's an interesting point," she said. "Sometimes television encourages instant answers when real life isn't that simple." Sunny joined in. "But public figures influence millions. Doesn't that create an expectation that they'll respond when important issues arise?" Scarlett considered the question before answering. "It creates expectations, absolutely. But expectations shouldn't erase someone's right to think before they speak." The room became noticeably quieter. Joy folded her hands. "Some people would say silence sends a message too." Scarlett met her gaze calmly. "Sometimes it does. Other times, silence simply means someone is trying to understand every side before contributing." Sarah smiled gently. "I think a lot of viewers can relate to that. We all know what it's like to say something too quickly and wish we'd had another day to think." The audience laughed softly. The tension eased for only a moment. Joy returned with another question. "But don't celebrities benefit from public attention? Isn't there a responsibility that comes with that?" Scarlett answered without hesitation. "There is responsibility. I've never denied that. But responsibility isn't the same as surrendering every private thought or every personal decision to public debate." The applause grew louder. Whoopi raised her eyebrows, sensing that every word now carried extra weight. "I think we're getting into something bigger than celebrity," she observed. "We're talking about where the line exists between public interest and personal boundaries." "Exactly," Scarlett replied. "That line matters." Sunny leaned forward. "So where would you draw it?" Scarlett took a slow breath. "I'd draw it where someone stops being seen as a human being and starts being treated like a headline." The audience fell completely silent. Even Joy paused. The conversation had become less about disagreement and more about perspective. Yet the intensity remained. Every camera focused tightly on the table. Every expression mattered. Every pause seemed longer than the last. No one interrupted. No one rushed to the next topic. For the first time that morning, the conversation wasn't being driven by prepared questions. It was unfolding naturally. Whoopi smiled. "That's probably one of the most honest answers we've heard today." Scarlett smiled back. Honesty usually isn't loud. The audience responded with another wave of applause as the discussion continued, each host offering a different perspective while respecting the others. The debate had become thoughtful instead of hostile. But everyone watching could feel that the conversation was only becoming more compelling. The applause slowly faded, but the energy in the studio refused to settle. What had begun as a light-hearted celebrity interview had evolved into something far more compelling, a thoughtful exchange of perspectives. The audience could sense it. No one reached for their phone. No one whispered. Every eye remained fixed on the table as the conversation continued. Whoopi Goldberg glanced around at the panel before speaking. "You know," she said, "this is why conversations like these matter. People don't always have to agree. Sometimes the value is simply hearing a perspective you hadn't considered." Scarlett nodded appreciatively. "I couldn't agree more. Healthy disagreement is important. What's difficult is when disagreement immediately turns into judgment." Sunny Hostin leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "But isn't that partly the reality of social media now? Everything becomes instant. Every opinion becomes a headline." Scarlett let out a small laugh. "Exactly. and headlines rarely capture the entire conversation. Several audience members applauded. Joy Behar smiled before asking another question. So how do you deal with criticism? You must read some of it. Scarlett smiled. I used to read much more than I should have. The audience chuckled. I think every performer reaches a point where they realize that if you allow strangers to define your confidence, you'll spend your entire life chasing approval you'll never fully receive. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Sarah Haynes jumped in. I think that's something a lot of people can relate to, not just actors. It is, Scarlett replied. Whether you're working in entertainment, teaching, running a business, or raising a family, someone will always think you're doing it wrong. The audience laughed again. Joy folded her arms thoughtfully. But public figures also shape culture. Doesn't criticism sometimes help? It absolutely can, Scarlett answered. Constructive criticism has helped me grow throughout my career. The problem isn't criticism. The problem is assuming someone's worst intentions before asking questions. Whoopi nodded. That's a distinction people often miss. The conversation became even more reflective. Sunny looked toward Scarlett. Have you ever wanted to respond publicly to something written about you and then decided not to? Scarlett smiled knowingly. More times than I can count. The audience laughed. There were moments when I wanted to explain myself. Then I'd ask, would this actually help anyone understand me better, or would it simply extend the story for another week? Joy tilted her head. So you choose silence. Sometimes. And people misunderstand that. They often do. A thoughtful silence settled over the studio. One audience member quietly applauded, followed by many others. Whoopi smiled. I think that's the challenge today. We expect immediate explanations for everything. Scarlett nodded. And immediate explanations usually leave no room for reflection. The cameras slowly moved across the panel, capturing each thoughtful expression. Even though opinions differed, no one interrupted. No one raised their voice. The intensity came from conviction rather than conflict. Joy leaned slightly closer. Let me ask you something else. Scarlett looked at her attentively. Do you think audiences have changed? Scarlett considered the question carefully. I think audiences have become faster. The room became quiet. We consume information at incredible speed. We react before we verify. We celebrate before we understand. We criticize before we listen. Sunny nodded slowly. That's difficult to argue with. Sarah smiled. Maybe we're all guilty of that sometimes. I know I have been, Scarlett admitted. None of us are perfect. The honesty surprised the audience. Instead of defending herself, she had acknowledged her own imperfections. That admission changed the atmosphere. Joy noticed it too. You know, she said, I appreciate that answer. Scarlett smiled warmly. I appreciate the question. For the first time since the discussion had taken its unexpected turn, both women shared a brief laugh. The audience responded with applause. Whoopi looked toward the crowd. This is exactly why we invite people here. Not because everyone agrees, but because conversations like this remind us that disagreement doesn't have to become division. The applause grew louder. As the cameras widened their shot, the producers exchanged glances behind the scenes. They had expected another entertaining celebrity interview. Instead, they were witnessing a discussion that had captured every person in the room. The audience remained completely engaged, wondering where the conversation would go next as the atmosphere grew even more reflective, proving that sometimes the strongest moments on television aren't created by shouting. They're created by people willing to challenge each other's ideas while continuing to listen. The conversation lingered in the air long after the applause faded. There was no rush to change the subject, no commercial break arriving at just the right moment to relieve the tension. Instead, the studio seemed to embrace it. Every person at the table understood that the discussion had become bigger than any upcoming film or promotional interview. Whoopi glanced across the panel with a thoughtful smile. I think we've all made strong points today, she said. The interesting part is that no one here is really arguing against respect. We're just looking at it from different angles. Scarlett nodded. Exactly. Respect isn't something that should only exist when people agree. Sunny Hostin leaned forward. So let me ask this. Have you ever changed your opinion because someone challenged you? Scarlett smiled. More than once. The audience responded with quiet applause. I've learned the most from conversations where someone respectfully questioned my perspective instead of trying to embarrass me. Joy Behar rested her chin lightly on one hand. That's easier said than done on television. A ripple of laughter spread through the audience. Scarlett laughed too. It definitely is. Joy continued. People expect big moments. They expect dramatic reactions. Calm discussions don't always become the clips everyone shares. Scarlett answered almost immediately. Maybe that's something worth changing. The audience applauded again. Sarah Haynes looked around the table. I think viewers sometimes forget that conversations continue after the cameras stop rolling. They do, Scarlett replied. The most meaningful discussions I've had usually happened after everyone else had already moved on. Alyssa Farah Griffin joined in. And yet public perception is often built from 30-second clips. Scarlett nodded. That's what makes context so important. For a brief moment, everyone sat in reflective silence. Then Joy asked another question. If you could change one thing about how celebrities and the media interact, what would it be? Scarlett took a slow breath before responding. I'd encourage more curiosity and less certainty. The audience listened closely. We've become very comfortable deciding who someone is after one interview, one headline, or one viral clip. Real people are more complicated than that. Sunny smiled. I don't think anyone here could argue with that. Whoopi looked toward the audience. How many people here have ever been misunderstood? Nearly every hand in the audience went up. The room filled with soft laughter. There you go, Whoopi said. Looks like we're all experts on that feeling. Scarlett smiled warmly. And that's why empathy matters. Joy nodded thoughtfully. You know, when we started this conversation, I wasn't sure where it would go. Scarlett answered with a grin. Neither was I. The audience laughed again. The atmosphere had changed. The intensity remained, but it was no longer driven by disagreement. Instead, it came from genuine engagement. Each question uncovered another layer, and each answer invited another perspective. A producer signaled from behind the cameras that they were approaching the final minutes of the segment. Whoopi noticed. We've got time for one more question. The studio became quiet again. Joy looked directly at Scarlett. If a young actor watching today asked you how to survive constant public attention, what would you tell them? Scarlett paused longer than she had for any previous question. Finally, she spoke. I'd tell them not to confuse applause with self-worth. The audience became completely silent. I'd tell them that compliments feel wonderful, criticism can hurt, but neither should decide who you are. Your character has to exist long before the spotlight finds you, and it has to remain after the spotlight moves on. Several audience members began applauding before she had even finished. The applause grew louder. Sunny smiled. That's a powerful message. Sarah nodded. I think it applies to everyone, not just actors. Alyssa agreed. Especially in a world where everyone feels they're being watched. Joy looked across the table. I may not agree with every point you made today. Scarlett smiled. I wouldn't expect you to. Joy continued. But I appreciate that you answered every question directly. And I appreciate that you asked them honestly. The audience erupted into another round of applause. Whoopi stood, smiling as she looked at both women. I think that's the kind of conversation people need more of. Not because everyone reached the same conclusion, but because everyone stayed willing to listen. The cameras slowly pulled back, capturing the panel, the applauding audience, and the unmistakable feeling that the discussion had left a lasting impression. Even as the applause echoed through the studio, viewers could sense that the debate would continue long after the broadcast ended, with countless opinions waiting to unfold once the episode reached audiences everywhere. As the cameras pulled away and the familiar closing music began to play, the applause continued long after the hosts had thanked the audience. The conversation had ended, but the energy in the studio hadn't. Crew members exchanged glances. Audience members were still discussing what they had just witnessed as they slowly made their way toward the exits. It hadn't been the loudest discussion ever held around the table, but it had been one of the most thoughtful. Behind the scenes, the mood was noticeably different from the tension viewers had sensed only minutes earlier. Scarlett thanked each of the hosts for the conversation, shaking hands before preparing to leave the studio. Whoopi smiled. That's what live television is supposed to do. Scarlett nodded. It doesn't always have to end with everyone agreeing. Joy smiled back. No, but it should end with everyone feeling heard. Scarlett extended her hand. I can agree with that. Joy shook it with a smile, drawing applause from several audience members who were still nearby. Sunny laughed. Well, I think social media is about to have a very busy afternoon. Everyone around the table shared a laugh. Outside the studio, the conversation quickly took on a life of its own. Viewers began posting their reactions, sharing clips from the discussion and debating the different perspectives that had been raised. Some praised Scarlett's calm and measured responses, saying she demonstrated confidence without becoming confrontational. Others appreciated Joy's willingness to ask difficult questions, arguing that respectful challenges often produce the most meaningful conversations. Comment sections filled with thousands of opinions. One viewer wrote that the discussion proved people could disagree without shouting. Another said it reminded them that listening is just as important as speaking. Others debated where the line should be drawn between public accountability and personal privacy. Some felt celebrities owed more transparency to their audiences, while others believed everyone deserved boundaries, regardless of fame. As the hours passed, entertainment commentators and television fans continued discussing the exchange. Rather than focusing on a dramatic argument, many highlighted how the conversation stayed respectful despite differing opinions. It became a reminder that the strongest moments aren't always the loudest. They're often the ones that encourage people to think. Back at the studio, the hosts reflected on the discussion after the audience had gone home. Whoopi leaned back in her chair. "I think we did what we're supposed to do." Sunny nodded. "We asked questions." Sarah smiled. "And we listened to the answers." Alyssa added, "That's becoming a rare thing." Joy looked toward the now empty audience seats. "I still stand by my questions." Scarlett smiled. "And I still stand by my answers." For a moment, everyone laughed. There was no bitterness, no lingering hostility, only mutual respect for a conversation that had challenged everyone involved. As Scarlett walked out of the building, photographers called her name, hoping for one more statement. She simply smiled, waved, and stepped into her car, leaving the discussion to speak for itself. Sometimes the most memorable conversations aren't remembered because someone won. They're remembered because everyone walked away with something to think about. And perhaps that was the real story. Not a clash of personalities, but a reminder that honest dialogue can leave a lasting impression without turning into hostility. Now it's your turn. If you had been sitting at that table, whose perspective would you have agreed with most? Do you think public figures owe more of themselves to the public, or should personal boundaries always come first? Share your opinion in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy dramatic, cinematic fictional stories inspired by the world of television, celebrity interviews, and unforgettable conversations, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Prime Spotlight, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.